What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and we are back with Spider-Man, which, by the way, yes, I will do videos on Rogue and Gambit to get ready for Marvel Rivals. I'm not going to leave you hanging. But Spider-Man's new powers are kind of insane here. So what this does is this initially picks up with Peter Parker essentially having a nightmare about the death of Aunt May at the hands of Hellgate. And as a little bit of a refresher here, Hellgate is basically this villain that we don't really know anything about who showed up on Earth, ranting about how Peter's supposed to be the one to make him stronger. Hellgate refers to him as like the Prince of Steel Silk, different things like that. But essentially, Peter was defeated by Hellgate, and ultimately his story landed him here, where he's essentially part of the Guardians of the Galaxy, kind of a reformed version of the team. But the big concern that he has is that Hellgate is killing everyone he knows and loves back on Earth. But he has to get stronger if he's going to defeat Hellgate. And so in the midst of this horrific nightmare, he just kind of wakes up, and Rocket Raccoon is standing there. And he's like, "Hey boss, didn't really want to wake you, but then I heard the screams of existential terror. Is this a good time?" Right? And Peter's response here, right? Like, I told you, do not call me boss. Also, knock. And what's up with the gigantic gun? Because one of the things to know is that while this team is technically a team, and Rocket's the only real member of the traditional Guardians of the Galaxy who are here, Peter's not here because he wants to be. It's really more just his circumstances that led him here, and that's really it, right? It's just kind of along for the ride for this period in time. But by and large, he doesn't want to be called the boss of the team because he doesn't see himself that way. And so that's why Rocket is just like, in regards to your questions and in order, number one, all the Peters that I know are lame, and Spider-Man is a worse name than Star-Lord. Number two, knocking is for simps, which is probably the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. And number three, he was like, this baby, this gun, the biggest gun you've ever seen, is generally meant for perforating people that disagree with me, right? Like, I just use it to kill people I don't like. But Peter's just kind of like, okay, look, why are you here specifically in my room with a gigantic gun in the middle of the night? And Rocket responds with the one response you don't want to hear when you're Peter Parker, which is, so you have to understand, because any explanation from Rocket Raccoon that starts off like that basically means that Rocket Raccoon's got problems, and now he's made his problems into your problems. And so that's why he's like, so you know how late-stage capitalism is a rigged game that punishes working-class guys like me who just want to carve out a little slice of peace and quietude? And Peter's like, now you're just concocting excuses. And there's like all these ships that are descending onto Rocket. And so after that, you jump to a place called Skrid City, just one of the many cities that exist out there in the world of Marvel Comics, where there's usually like gambling, some illicit activities, likely gladiatorial games, different things like that. And Peter just kind of talks for a second, right? He's like, I don't really get to travel that much. Usually there isn't enough money and time or guts to just step away from my responsibilities. But when I do go somewhere new, it always shocks me how quickly I can acclimate. I don't know what that says about me, but right now, I'm grateful. Otherwise, I would be losing my mind. And so you end up picking up with this guy out here, right, who basically says, do-gooding when you're deep in the hole is a poor choice, Rocket. People talk, cameras see. The Black Order put a bounty out, which means you have an expiration date. No better incentives for a businessman to call in his chips. So where's my money? Because Rocket Raccoon's in debt, as he usually is. In Marvel Comics, this dude always owes somebody money. He's like that one friend that we all have, right? For some reason, you keep lending him money, you know you're never going to get it back, but you kind of hope you do one day, but you never do, right? That's what Rocket Raccoon is in Marvel. And so Rocket just responds, right? He was like, slow that roll, Dinwicket. I put down a deposit. I was working my tail off raising capital when Squidhead kidnapped me. Now, of course, he's referring to Zonto, and that's kind of what's been going on up to this point, that Zonto rescued Peter and then made Peter the promise that he would help him become stronger, which is how Peter Parker got his newest suit. But Rocket Raccoon and all these guys who were basically part of the Guardians of the Galaxy under Peter, they were all prisoners of Zonto at one point. But now that they're all free, they actually allied with Zonto, and they're all just kind of going forward from there. But that's why Zonto was like, he was both inebriated and quite penniless when I acquired him for science. So it's okay that I did. But Rocket is just kind of like, then this dork freed me and promised some payola for my pain and suffering. And Peter's like, I mean, that's half true, but I'm not a dork. And then Rocket's like, but I was roped into a charity gig playing bus driver for all the other lab rats. And so Peter's just like, I mean, can we skip ahead? Since you didn't blow us out of orbit, I assume there's some way that Rocket can even up. And initially Rocket's just like, get out of here. Because the big concern about Rocket is that Peter is going to talk him into a deeper hole, because there is kind of a way that you do these things. And despite all of his faults and all of his imperfections, Rocket has two things going for him. Number one, he's the most adorable critter you ever saw. And number two, the dude has a silver tongue. And so that's where Dinwick is just kind of like, well, I mean, I did have one thought, now that you mention it. And he asks them, right, during times of intergalactic chaos, because this story takes place at the time of Imperial, where all the different leaders of the empires of the universe are literally being killed and going to war with each other, Dinwick says, the masses will pay through their breathing orifices for a distraction. Are you familiar with the concept of a pay-per-view event, Spider-Man? Now, this reveals two main things. Number one, yes, it is an accurate statement that when there are times of massive upheaval in a universe, people want distractions, right? Sentient races want distractions from the chaos that exists out there. They understand the chaos is there and they will process it in their own time. But until they do, they want something to take their mind off of it. Nobody was meant to focus on danger 100% of the time. And number two, this whole planet is decades behind, because when was the last time anyone paid for a pay-per-view? My guy. Like, it's just been forever. So Peter just kind of responds, right? He's like, I mean, I've never had the money to pay for a view, but how do you also know my name, right? And Rocket's just like, I mean, dude, you're Spider-Man, right? Like, the whole universe knows who you are. You would have to leave this universe to find someone who doesn't. And even out in the multiverse, I'm sure people are aware of you because you exist all over the place, right? But Dinwick is actually like, you have fans far from Earth who would enjoy watching you and your comrades participate in a good-natured sporting event, Betty wrestling. And at that point, Zanto's just like, oh yeah, so I can't do that. Mine are the hands of a maestro, right? Ill-suited for pugilism, right? And like, everybody keeps going with the same thing. Well, I mean, I'd love to, but you know, I don't know if I can do Betty wrestling, right? Peter has no clue what's going on here. He has no clue what's happening. And Rocket even tries to tell him. He was like, in case you can't tell from that guy's grin, do not agree to this. You do not want this action. But Peter Parker, ever the superhero, is just kind of like, look, if I fix this, you will call me by my real name, right? And at that point, Rocket's like, I mean, I'd rather die, you slack-jawed backwater yokel. But Peter's just kind of like, if this makes you even, I will fight whatever, so long as I don't have to kill it. And everybody's just kind of like, all right, man, I mean, we tried to warn you, my guy. And so, like, you jump to this huge gladiatorial game, right? This huge, like, fighting match. And Dinwick just addresses everybody, right? He's like, today's Dinwick drop brought to you in conjunction with Mojo World Incorporated, which is amazing that that's being incorporated. For those of you guys who don't know, Mojo is amazing. Mojo is literally just like this really trashy reality TV type person. So basically like all the reality TV people that you see here in the real world. But like Mojo's just a producer running the whole thing behind the scenes and just providing people in the Mojoverse with just incredibly trashy reality television, fights, gladiatorial games, things like that. So it's kind of dope that it's being broadcast there. Mojo is OG double OG in Marvel Comics, been around since forever. But Dinwick continues on, right? This is an exhibition match against the Titanic Teclathian, which I'm pretty sure is how you pronounce it, our very own Betty, and her opponent, so-called hero of Earth here in the 616. You hate to love him, the succulent Spider-Man. So Spider-Man has unwittingly agreed to face off against this titanic beast that looks like it would absolutely tear him to pieces. And he just kind of looks at it all and doesn't really even like show any fear. He was like, you know what, succulent Spider-Man? That's close enough. So I feel like Peter's gonna start going with that. Like, I'm the succulent Spider-Man, the delicious Spider-Man. And Lilith, right, a member of the Guardians, is just kind of like, look, typically I would wager against you in direct combat against this thing, but Xanto's flexi suit should provide ample protection and defensive options. Still, why do you take on the little one's death this way? And Peter just says because he needs help and he's too proud to ask for it. And Lilith asks him, right, like, why do it alone? And literally Rocket just grabs him and just like pulls him away. And Rocket's just kind of like, so what's the scam here, right? Like, I mean, are you gonna like whip the rubes into a frenzy and then like we just put one in Dinwick's dome piece? Like we just bust a cap in his skull? Like, I mean, what's like, Peter's gonna assassinate the guy? Like, I would pay good money to read a comic where Peter Parker assassinates some dude indiscriminately. I guess technically he did. What was it? Peter Parker from Earth 8351, the assassin Spider-Man from Spider-Verse. So I guess technically he was an assassin there, but still, right? It's kind of nuts because Peter just tells him, like, we made a deal. I shook like way too many creepy alien hands on it. I win this and we leave. And Rocket's just like, but I still got my own thing going on here. And Peter's just like, then I'm gonna go fight this giant space monster on your behalf before your greed gets all over me, right? Like, I'm not playing this game. I'm just gonna defeat this thing. We're out of here. I don't care what you have going on. And so one of the cool things is Peter kind of chimes in here and he says banter, right? Helping a friend, a gangster who happens to have 8 hands instead of the usual, completely acclimatized, normal. My life is totally normal because it is. Despite everything going on here, it's kind of business as usual for Peter Parker, just in a different locale, on a different planet, light years away from Earth. And so that's where Dinwiddie chimes in, right? Spider-Man and his companion enter the arena to kick off our marvelous 2-on-1. And Peter's just kind of like, no companion, right? It's just me. And that's where Zonto's like, oh, he doesn't know. He doesn't know. Like, that's perfect. It is so perfect. And Lilith is like, what does Peter not know? And that's where Rocket's like, I mean, how long do you have, right? This guy doesn't know anything. But again, like, Peter has no clue about what's actually going on here, because at that point he starts facing off against Betty directly and just kind of doing the Peter Parker thing, right? Cracking jokes, making banter. As we learned from Dan Slott's Spider-Man Renew Your Vows, he does that to try to throw his villains off kilter. Of course, we don't really know that Betty like actually understands what it is that he's saying. So if anything, he's just kind of maintaining habit than anything else. And that's why he says, like, I'm sure you're a lovely monster and all, but I have to put you to bed because a talking raccoon has a gambling problem. Sorry about that, right? And again, Dinwiddie comes in, right? Betting channels are open. I repeat, bet on any of our 3 combatants. I'm offering 2-to-1 that Betty dismembers Earth's mightiest hero, 50-to-1 that Spider-Man renders the Beast unconscious, 100-to-1 that the Technarch stands alone at the end. And that's where Peter's like, are you betting on my suit, right? And that's where he starts to realize what's going on. And he screams at Zonto and he was like, the suit is still alive? And Zonto's just like, I love deception of the self-righteous, right? Because Peter thought it was dead the entire time. And even Rocket's just like, I thought it was weird that he gave you the smackdown for enslaving us, but you kept wearing the suit. That said, he is a human, so I just figured he was just a hypocrite more than anything else. But Peter thought it wasn't real, right? He was like, Zonto said it was a husk. A husk is not alive. A husk is the shell of a former living thing. But Zonto kind of corrects him, right? He was like, I mean, I didn't technically lie, right? That linguistic faux pas falls on you. I told the truth, right? Under the power of my restraining circuits, all cognitive functioning of the Technarch was overridden, and its body responds to the mental commands of the user. It's a husk. And Peter's just like, I want it freed, right? Like, just because you put dampeners, like mental dampeners on this thing, does not mean it was not alive and is not still alive, right? Free this thing. And Zonto's just kind of like, I mean, it looks outstanding on you, right? It adds the right amount of bubble to the buttocks, right? It makes your butt look nice, Pete. And Pete's just like the whole time, right? Bobbing and weaving with Betty. Like, how do I free this thing? And Zonto's just like, tell it to reboot. But here's the problem. The suit protects you and makes you exponentially stronger. Are you certain now is the time? And Peter tells the suit, reboot. And so what happens, right? The suit freezes up. Peter goes into this T-pose and he's just floating in the middle of the arena like Jesus, right? It's crazy. Betty just like immediately bites into him, closes down on him, and Zonto's just kind of like, I mean, look, he asked for the factory reset, right? It's not my fault he's a hysterical human. I gave him what he wanted. And so at that point, you actually get into what is a kind of symbiotic connection between Peter and the Technarch. And so it's kind of cool because they basically get each other's own stories. That what you get here is the Technarch saying, data block confirmed, early memory tree undamaged. I'm one of the digisymphonic of the Technarch. And where Peter's just kind of like, what's happening, right? Like, why can't I move? That the Technarch just tells him, right, quiet yourself. I don't revisit this memory often. A birth is a precious moment. And then you get a moment of like Peter Parker being bitten by the radioactive spider. And that's where the Technarch, not really understanding what's going on, is like, what is that hideous thing? And Peter just says, the spider that bit me. And that's where the Technarch is like, biting you was part of your birth? Like, that's disgusting. But then Peter gets his story, right? He says, we're having a memory interpolation error. How fun, right? Do try to hold your consciousness together as my operating system separates out of our memory packet. So basically, our minds separate from each other. So we're not just kind of like one amalgamous form. And so Peter, in ends up seeing Magus, right? Birth death rights, your father, and that's where the Technarch responds from a limited perspective. Now, I will specify, this is not Warlock. Right, I will specify that ahead of time. The funny thing about this, though, is that nonetheless, Magus is still basically his father in some capacity. For those of you guys who don't know, when it comes to the Technarch, while Magus was eventually killed by Nimrod, Magus was basically the leader of the Technarch and was the most powerful member of the Technarch. So essentially, he was the father of all Technarch that existed across their entire race. But that's why it's stated from a limited perspective, not really like direct offspring, just more of, I am the reason why you exist, that kind of thing. But that's when the Technarch looks and realizes Aunt May, right? Sees Aunt May in Peter's head. And Peter's just like, I don't want you in my head, right? Like, get out of my head right now. And again, it's kind of back and forth, that seemingly this Technarch was destroyed, or was supposed to be destroyed, or abandoned by his own race, and hasn't been a part of it for quite some time. That this guy gets the view of Peter going against Hellgate, that Hellgate had beat the absolute tar out of Peter Parker, that this Technarch was kind of floating through space, abandoned and alone. And in fact, Peter recognizes that. He's like, you were alone, drifting through space for a few hundred years. He says, do not judge. It was a choice. And Peter's like, was it the right choice? And the Technarch ultimately ended up coming across Zonto, where Zonto addresses him. And he says, donating such a capable body to the pursuit of science is as noble as one gets, friend. Waste not, want not. And that's where the Technarch says, I was shamed in the fact that I did it, right? That I should not have given myself away like that. Because for the Technarch, while they can separate their physical forms into like different components, it's giving a part of yourself away. It'd be like a human being removing like an arm or a hand or something like that. There's some shame in that. But again, the Technarch gets the view of Hellgate, right? Where Hellgate, after defeating Peter and quite literally leaving him for dead on a barren world where he was ultimately discovered by Zonto, that Hellgate tells Peter, Prince of Steel Silk, your homeworld survives at my pleasure. You have lost your right to it. Should Nicodemu have truthful eyes and you somehow survive the proving grounds, stay here. If you ever return to Earth, you will watch all you cherish ground to powder beneath my boot. And so that's where the Technarch is like, this is where Zonto found you hiding, right? You felt shame over the fact that you were so readily defeated and told not to return home. And so that's Peter's motivation, because the motivation of Hellgate was to basically become stronger by defeating Peter, or Peter was supposed to make him stronger. Again, we still don't necessarily have all that mythos understood, right? Hellgate answers to Nicodemu. We don't really know the whole idea behind Nicodemu and his role with regards to why it is that he has Hellgate fighting Peter outside of just making him stronger. But we didn't really know why Peter didn't return. We assumed it was just because he wanted to become stronger so he could defeat Hellgate. But outside of that, we didn't really have an answer. And now we do. There's a sense of shame coupled with a sense of duty that's driving him to become more capable so he can get back and he can defeat Hellgate. And so that's where both Peter and the Technarch separate from each other. And like right off the bat, the Technarch quite literally just grabs Betty, right? And just holds Betty's mouth open. So Betty's just completely powerless against all of this. And the Technarch says, I would say that sharing a consciousness has been an entertaining distraction, but I found your mental landscape of guilt and self-loathing to be frustratingly dull. Also, spiders are disgusting, and I pray I never meet one. You may call me Glitch. And Peter's just kind of like, I'm sorry that I wore you, right? But again, Glitch is just like, we will not speak of it again. Now, shall we get on with the tedium of living? And this just leads to all hell breaking loose, because at that point, Peter and Glitch and the rest of the Guardians just immediately start attacking everybody around them, right, trying to get themselves out of this place. And Peter just asks, right, like, what happens now? And Glitch is like, oh, what always happens, unfortunately, violence. And so he basically rebonds himself to Peter, and he says, you require protection. Not that I care if you are torn asunder. Will this suffice? Not as strong nor functional as I am, but exposure is a deep-seated concern of yours. And so Peter's just kind of like, what are you going to do? And that's where Glitch is like, I'm going to communicate with this gigantic monster. And so it's kind of crazy, because all the Guardians are fighting these guards, right? Glitch is basically dealing with Betty. Peter is fighting alongside everybody else with a portion of Glitch attached to himself now. And then when Peter shows back up here, he's just kind of like, a great day at the combat combat pit, huh? And Zonto's like, you sound quite jovial, considering you traded my perfect flexi suit for that pitiful shell. And Peter's just like, it's jokes. Or I remember how furious I am. And Peter's just like, where's Rocket, right? And that's where Lilith is like, he said I gave him a deposit and then ran off. And it turns out Rocket is going after Dinwicket, right? Where he's like, last chance to settle this like a gentleman, Dinwicksy. And Dinwicket's just like, I held up my end and you expect me to fold like some Chitauri governmental body. And Peter just like grabs Rocket and is just like, we're good, right? Let's get out of here as fast as we can. And where Rocket's kind of pissed off here, right? Peter's just like, I mean, let it go, right? He swindled you out of a deposit. Who cares? And Rocket's like, I paid this tool for info about my family and I am not leaving without it. You may not want to get back to the people that you left behind, but I do. But in the midst of all of this, Glitch stops all the chaos and the fighting. And he was like, pardon the interruption, Mr. Dinwicket. And he's like, but Betty and I just had the most delightful conversation, a meeting of the minds, as it were. She would like to renegotiate her contract, or she's going to eat you one leg at a time. There's more, but frankly, it's just simply too gruesome for the more sensitive viewers. She is quite displeased with your labor policies, though. And Rocket's just like, yeah, I want in on that negotiation too, right? I want to be a part of that, right? And at that point, Glitch is just like, I mean, why not, right? It certainly beats pounding one another into mush, doesn't it? And so it's kind of a cool thing because once this is all done, they end up getting back to the ship. And so once they're there, there's actually this really cool conversation that goes on between Zonto and Peter, where Zonto asks him, are you planning to fuel those weapons with the power of benevolence, right? The good guy mode. And that's where Peter's like, it was the right thing to do, right? Not to mention that I have a complicated history with alien suits. And where you might find yourself a little curious about what it is that they're discussing, it's kind of filled in, right? Because Zonto says the Technarch was a willing participant in my experiment. And Peter's just like, I mean, I know, right? I saw his memories. And Zonto says, you still feel that freedom is better than despair, letting Glitch be his own being. And Peter just says, he hasn't asked to go back to the way it was. And Zonto says, yet. But the universe is a big place, my boy. Not everyone subscribes to human definitions of morality. You are not the end-all be-all of what is right and what is wrong just because you believe you are. And that's where Peter's just like changing topics. How's our project coming along? Right? And that's where Zonto is just kind of like slowly, right? Your biology is elusive, but together, I am certain that we can achieve the goal of making you stronger. Because despite his duplicitous nature, Zonto is a guy who will maintain his promises if he makes it. And the promise that he made to Peter is, we will figure out a way to make you more capable and to make you stronger. And so in the midst of that, right, like Rocket kind of busts in. And he's like, normally when I clear my throat, that's just me pretending when I walk in on something awkward. But this time it's got vomit in it because you're science snuggling with him. I was going to tell you that your ex-underpants has a lock on an operable Stargate. And Peter's just like, hold on a second, right? But like, Rocket takes off and he was like, but you just keep snogging the psychopath who kidnapped us and writing me for working with undesirables. And Peter's just like, look, it's not that simple. But from Rocket's perspective, it's like, that guy made slaves out of us. And now you're hanging out with him. But for Peter, it's one of these things where it's like, he has what I need to be able to get back home. And at least on some level, he would think Rocket would understand, right? Finding his family, Rocket would do anything for that. Beg, borrow, steal, and kill. Peter's kind of in that exact same boat. But the problem is that in the midst of all of this, as Peter's chasing down Rocket, Peter is snatched aside by Lilith, right? And Lilith is just kind of like, hey. And Peter's just kind of like, hi? And Lilith is just like, I want to ask you a question, right? And Peter's like, okay, I mean, I was in the middle of something, but, you know. And she just says, right, you gave up strength for the freedom of another life form. Why? And Peter's just like, it was the right thing to do, right? Like, wouldn't you have done the same thing? And she kisses him. Of course, then she apologizes and was like, look, you know, I'm sorry, you know, and Peter's like, I mean, it's okay. She's like, no, I did not have permission. And Peter's just kind of like, I mean, you have permission if you want to, right? You know, bow, chicka, wow, wow. With that being said, guys, we're going to bring this to an end. Peter's knocking boots with aliens. But hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, drop a like, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button, and I will catch you all later. Peace.